Get off my property. Walter Hayes raised the shotgun before the knocking even stopped. Four massive bikers, soaking wet. One of them barely standing. His hands didn't shake, but his chest did. If this story already has your heart pounding, hit that subscribe button right now and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happened that night on Highway 17 changed everything. The rain had been falling since early evening, but by 11 o'clock it had turned into something else entirely. It wasn't rain anymore. It was a punishment. The kind of storm that old-timers in Coahoma County called a river maker. The kind that swallowed roads whole and turned ditches into rivers and reminded you real fast that nature didn't care one single thing about your plans. Walter Hayes was still awake. That in itself wasn't unusual. Walter hadn't slept a full night in years, not since the arthritis settled into both his hands like an unwelcome tenant who refused to leave. But tonight he wasn't awake because of the pain. He was awake because of the numbers. The notebook was open on the counter, grease-stained at the corners. The kind of notebook that had been opened and closed so many times the spine had given up holding it together. Walter's reading glasses sat low on his nose as he moved his finger down the column of figures for the third time that evening, as if looking at them again might make them change. They didn't change. $42,000. That was what the bank wanted. That was what stood between Hayes Auto and Diner and the end of everything. $42,000, and Richard Vance, that smooth-talking, cologne-wearing real estate developer who had been circling this property like a vulture for the better part of a decade, had already told people around town that he expected to own this land by the end of the month. Walter closed the notebook. He pressed both hands flat against the counter and stared at the wall at the framed photographs that lined it the way other people lined their walls with paintings. Evelyn had hung them. She always said photographs were more honest than paintings. A painting tells you how someone wanted to feel, she'd told him once. A photograph tells you how they actually did. There was one photograph he could never quite look at for more than a few seconds at a time. A young man in a military uniform, dark hair, a crooked smile that sat slightly higher on the left side than the right, a smile that was so distinctly, unmistakably Walter's own smile that it almost hurt to see it on someone else's face, even after all these years. Daniel. His son had been 23 years old when that photograph was taken. He never made it to 24. Walter turned away from the wall. "You coming to bed?" Evelyn's voice drifted in from the back hallway, soft, careful, the way she'd learned to speak to him over the years in the late hours when she knew his mind was in a dark place. "In a minute," Walter said. She didn't push. 51 years of marriage had taught her when to push and when to leave a man to his silence. She disappeared back down the hallway without another word. Walter walked to the window that looked out over the parking lot and the pump islands and the long, empty stretch of Highway 17 beyond. The rain was hitting the glass so hard it was nearly opaque, just sheets of white water and the occasional blue-white crack of lightning that turned everything ghost pale for half a second. He was about to turn away from the window. That was when he saw the headlights. They came from the east, not fast but lurching. Unsteady, the way a car moves when the driver is fighting something, struggling to keep the vehicle going in a straight line. Then more lights behind it, and more behind those. And Walter counted 1, 2, 3, 4 sets of headlights swinging into his lot, each one lower than a car's headlights should be. Motorcycles. His whole body went cold. Not the kind of cold that comes from temperature. The kind that starts somewhere behind the sternum and spreads outward, ancient and involuntary and impossible to explain to someone who hasn't lived inside it. He watched them pull in, watched them park in a loose cluster near the diner entrance, watched the riders climb off big men, all of them wearing the kind of jackets that were visible even through the rain, even through the dark. The leather, the patches. Walter's jaw set so hard his back teeth ached. And he was 19 years old the first time he'd seen a group of men who looked like that. A roadhouse outside of Clarksdale, 1969. He'd stopped to use the payphone. Just the payphone. He'd been back on the road 40 minutes later, and for the 2 months after that, he couldn't lift his arm above his shoulder without the broken ribs screaming at him. He'd told Evelyn he'd been in a car accident. She'd believed him for about 3 days before she stopped pretending to. He had never forgotten the feel of a leather boot against his ribs. He had never forgotten what it was like to be on the ground, unable to get up, listening to laughter. He was 72 years old now, and it didn't matter. Some things don't become history just because time passes. Some things stay present tense. The knocking started. 3 hard strikes against the diner door. Then 3 more. Then a voice muffled through the storm and through the glass, but urgent, desperate in a way that was immediately unmistakably different from threatening. "Please, somebody, we need help. He's bad." Walter didn't move. He stood at the window with his arms crossed and his jaw set and that old cold thing spreading through his chest, and he watched the rain come down, and he did not move. "Walter!" He startled. Evelyn was standing in the kitchen doorway. She'd put her robe on. Her gray hair was loose around her shoulders. She was looking past him toward the diner entrance, toward the sound of the knocking. "There are men outside," Walter said. His voice came out flat. "I know. I can hear them." She walked toward the window and looked out. He watched her face. She was quiet for a long moment, and he could see her taking in what he'd already taken in the leather, the patches the size of the men in the storm. Then she said very quietly, "One of them looks hurt." "Evelyn." "I said one of them looks hurt, Walter." Her voice didn't rise. It never did. That was the thing about Evelyn Hayes that people sometimes mistook for gentleness, the quietness. But there wasn't anything gentle about the way she said those words. There was something underneath them that was harder than anything Walter had been building up in his chest for the last 30 seconds. "We don't know who they are," he said. "We know they're out in that storm," she said. "That's not our responsibility." And then she looked at him then, really looked at him the way she had. A habit of doing that made him feel both completely known and completely exposed at the same time, as if she could see not just what he was saying, but everything he was saying it to protect. "Go get your shotgun if you want," she said, "but I'm opening the door." She walked past him toward the diner entrance. He stood there for 3 full seconds, which is a very long time when every second has weight, and then he moved. He did get the shotgun. The man they were carrying between them was big, or had been big before whatever had taken the life out of him. He was blonde, 40-ish, broad across the shoulders, and his face was the color of old wax. He was semi-conscious at best, his head lolling against the shoulder of the younger man supporting him on the left side. His breathing was audible even over the storm. Each inhale a wet, labored effort, each exhale a half groan. The man who'd been knocking was the one who spoke first. He was dark-haired, early 30s, with a jaw that needed shaving and eyes that needed sleep. He looked at the shotgun without flinching. "Sir, I'm not asking you to trust us," he said. "I'm asking you to look at him." Walter looked. He didn't want to. Everything in him was screaming to step back, to send these men back out into the rain, to close and lock the door, and call the county sheriff and let the professionals handle it. He was 72 years old with bad hands and bad knees and a mortgage that was about to eat him alive, and he did not need this tonight. He did not need any of this. But he looked at the man they were holding up between them, and the man looked back at him. Just barely. His eyes were half open, blue bloodshot, sunken, and they found Walter's face with the particular focus of someone using everything they have just to stay present. He didn't say anything. He couldn't. But there was something in those eyes that wasn't threatening. That wasn't anything Walter had expected to find there. It looked, God help him, like dignity. Like a man who was ashamed of needing help, but needed it anyway. "What's wrong with him?" Walter heard himself say. "Pneumonia," the dark-haired man said. "Started 2 days ago. We were trying to make it to Memphis. The highway closed. We've stopped at 4 other places." He stopped himself, steadied his voice. "Please, he needs to be warm. He needs to be dry. That's all we're asking." "Is he contagious?" Evelyn said from somewhere behind Walter's left shoulder. The dark-haired man blinked. Then, almost despite himself, something crossed his face that might have been the ghost of a tired, startled smile. "No, ma'am, it's not that kind of pneumonia. He took some shrapnel years ago. It left some scarring. Sometimes it—" He stopped again. "No, he's not contagious." "Then bring him inside," Evelyn said. "Walter Hayes." Her voice was still quiet. It was always quiet, but there was a line in it now, not an edge exactly. A line, the kind that meant the conversation was over. Either we open this door or we live with what happens if we don't. He stepped aside. Man, the sick man's name was Boone Carter. That was what the young one, the dark-haired one who'd done the talking, told Walter while Evelyn got the back booth ready with blankets she'd retrieved from their living quarters in the rear of the building. The young man's name was Luke, and he said it the way people say names in hospitals, like the names are the most important thing left to hold on to. How long have you known him? Walter asked. He was standing near the counter with the shotgun rested against the cabinet to his right, close enough to reach far enough to not be a constant statement. Evelyn had given him that much credit. 6 years, Luke said. He was wringing water from the sleeve of his jacket, self-conscious, like he'd only just realized how much of the storm had come inside with him. He found me in a parking lot in Tupelo. He stopped. I wasn't in a good place. I wasn't in a good anything. He bought me a meal, drove me to a meeting, drove me to 100 meetings after that. He looked across the diner toward the back booth where the other 2 men were helping Boone lie down. Man saved my life. Whatever it looked like, whatever it sounds like, he saved my life. Walter didn't say anything. He was watching the other 2 men. Travis' heavy-set 50s, hands that moved with a practiced efficiency that seemed somehow incongruous with the tattoos running from his wrist to his collar, had taken Boone's jacket off with the focused care of someone who'd moved injured people before. And the 4th man, whose name Walter hadn't gotten yet, was standing by the window watching the lot. He's watching for what? Walter asked, tilting his chin toward the window man. Luke followed his gaze. In case we need to move him fast, he said simply. You had a gun when you answered the door. 3 houses before you had worse. We've learned to be ready. Something about that sentence sat in Walter's chest at an uncomfortable angle. He picked up the shotgun and walked it to the back storage room and set it on the shelf behind the motor oil. When he came back, Evelyn was already at the stove. You make soup in the middle of the night during a thunderstorm for strangers who scare your husband, Travis said. He was sitting at the counter not because he'd been invited to, but because he drifted there the way large men sometimes drift toward the nearest solid surface when they're tired and pretending not to be. Evelyn didn't look up from the pot. I've been making soup in the middle of the night for 60 years, she said. It's what I do when I don't know what else to do. Travis was quiet for a moment. Smart. It's practical, she said. Aman, he turned the coffee mug she'd set in front of him a quarter turn, then another quarter turn. He's going to be okay, he said. Boone, I know how it looks. It sounds worse than it is. We just needed to get him warm and dry and give him... He exhaled slowly. He wouldn't let us call an ambulance. You can imagine. Stubborn, Evelyn said. You have no idea. Oh, she said with the precise inflection of a woman who has been married to Walter Hayes for 51 years, I have some. Travis looked at her, and for the first time since they'd walked through the door, he laughed genuinely, suddenly, the way laughter happens when it catches you off guard and you don't have time to stop it. It wasn't a big laugh, but it was real. Walter, sitting at the far end of the counter, going through the motions of the work he always did when he needed to keep his hands busy, heard it. He didn't laugh, but something in the architecture of his shoulders shifted just slightly. By 1 a.m, the storm was if anything worse. The lights had flickered twice. The radio on the shelf by the register, Evelyn kept it tuned to a weather station from habit, was reporting road closures across 3 counties. The highway patrol had set up a barricade 8 miles east. There was no going anywhere until dawn at the earliest. Walter had accepted this. He had not accepted being comfortable with it, but he had accepted the fact of it. He was in the garage by 11:30. His garage, the attached repair bay that shared a wall with the diner, because one of the bikes had made a sound coming in that he'd recognized the way you recognize a voice. A specific kind of rattling that meant the carburetor had gotten water in it and would not, without intervention, start again when the time came. He hadn't offered to fix it. He'd just gone and started working on it. Luke appeared in the garage doorway about 20 minutes later. He stood there for a moment watching Walter work before he said anything. You don't have to do that. I know I don't, Walter said. That's Boone's bike. I know. Well, Luke was quiet. Walter could feel him trying to decide something. He kept working head down, hands moving through the familiar choreography of a job he'd done 10,000 times. The physical competence of it was something he could trust when everything else felt uncertain. "Can I ask you something?" Luke said. "You can try, Mom." "Why'd you let us in? You were scared, I could see it." Walter set down the wrench. He looked at his hands for a moment, the swollen knuckles, the stains that never quite washed out the roadmap of 72 years written in every line. He picked the wrench back up. "My wife," he said. "Just that?" "That's enough," Walter said. "That has always been enough." Luke was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that Walter thought the conversation was over. Then Luke said, "He talks about this stretch of highway sometimes. Boone does. Said there was something here that mattered. I never knew what he meant." He paused. "Maybe he just meant the diner." "Maybe," Walter said. But something about the way Luke had said it made Walter's hands slow just briefly on the metal in front of them. Just briefly. It was closer to 2 in the morning when the sound from the back booth made Walter look up. Boone Carter was sitting up. He looked like a man who had been pulled back from somewhere distant, pale, slow-moving, but present in a way he hadn't been when they'd carried him in. Evelyn was beside him with a bowl of soup and the expression she wore when she was making sure someone ate whether they wanted to or not. Boone was looking across the diner. He was looking at the wall, at the photographs. His eyes moved slowly across them the way eyes move when they're searching rather than wandering, and Walter watched from across the room and felt the cold thing start again in his chest, fainter this time, but present. He watched Boone Carter look at each photograph, the way a man looks at things he's been looking for. And then Boone Carter's gaze stopped moving. And Walter knew without being able to say how he knew exactly which photograph it had stopped on. He crossed the room. He stopped on the other side of the table and looked down at the man who looked back up at him with those half-open blue eyes, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Boone Carter said in a voice that was quiet and careful and weighted with something that had no business being this heavy after this many years. "You had a son." It wasn't a question. "Don't," Walter said. The word came out before he'd decided to say it. "His name was Daniel," Boone said. "Daniel Hayes. He was from Coahoma County to Mississippi. He played guitar. He had a photograph of a red truck he kept in his breast pocket." A pause, the labored breath. "And he was the bravest man I ever met in my entire life." Walter Hayes had not cried in 11 years. And the last time had been at Evelyn's mother's funeral in a pew in the back of a church in Greenville. And he had turned his face toward the wall and let the moment pass as quickly as he could, because men of his generation, men built the way he'd been built, in the place where he'd been built, had learned to treat grief the way you treat a structural problem. You shore it up, you reinforce it, you make it load-bearing. He did not cry now. But something happened in his face that was very close to the beginning of it. Something cracked, not broke, but cracked, and the light got in through the fracture and he couldn't stop it. "How do you know that name?" Walter said. His voice was barely his own. Boone Carter looked at him with those exhausted, ancient blue eyes and took a breath and began. Walter didn't sit down. He stood there on his side of the booth with both hands pressed flat against the table, and he looked at Boone Carter the way a man looks at something he doesn't yet have a category for. His mouth was open slightly, not in surprise or not only surprise, in the specific physical way that a man's mouth opens when language has temporarily left the building and the body hasn't gotten the message yet. Boone held his gaze. He didn't look away, didn't soften. It didn't give Walter the mercy of ambiguity. He just looked back with those water-pale eyes that had seen too much and rested in too little, and he let the silence do what silence does, which is expand until it fills every corner of the room, and you realize it was never really silent at all. "How long have you known?" Walter finally said. "Which part?" "Any of it. All of it." Walter's voice was lower than usual, contained, the way a river sounds when it's running fast beneath ice. "How long have you known where we were?" Boone shifted against the back of the booth. The movement cost him. Walter saw it in the tightening around his eyes, the brief catch in his breathing. He didn't complain. Walter was already learning that Boone Carter was not a man who complained about pain. 12 years, Boone said. The number landed in the room like something physical. Evelyn, who had been standing 3 feet away with the soup bowl still in her hands, set it down on the table with a careful, deliberate slowness, that meant she was using the motion to stay steady. 12 years, Walter repeated. I found you through the veteran records. Your son's unit. His hometown was in his file. Boone stopped, took the labored breath. I drove out here once about 11 years ago, sat in the lot for about an hour. Then I left. Why? Because I didn't know what to say. He looked down at his own hands, big hands scarred across the knuckles, the kind of hands that told the full biography of a man without him needing to say a word. I still don't. I just ran out of time to wait until I did. Walter pulled out the chair across from the booth and sat down in it. Not in the booth, he wasn't ready for that, but he sat because his legs had made the decision for him. Tell me, Walter said. It wasn't a request. Boone looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once and he began. The year was 1970. Boone had been 19 years old, which Walter registered with a particular quiet ache because Daniel had been 22, and his unit had been moving through a river valley 60 miles southwest of Da Nang when the ambush came. He didn't describe it the way people in movies describe combat. He described it the way people who were actually there describe it, which is in pieces, a sound here, a sensation there, and then suddenly you're somewhere else and you don't entirely know how you got there. I went down fast, Boone said. Took a round in the left leg, right through the thigh. I couldn't get up, couldn't drag myself. The fire was coming from 3 directions and everybody else was moving and He stopped. I was already writing myself off. You understand, I was 19 years old and I had already decided that was where it ended. Walter understood. He didn't say so. Your son came back for me. The sentence sat there between them. He didn't have to, Boone said. He was already clear. He'd made the tree line. He came back into open ground to get me. He paused again longer this time. He was talking the whole time he was dragging me. I couldn't hear most of it over the noise, but I remember he was singing, just under his breath. Not anything I recognized, just some song he knew. Boone shook his head slowly. I used to think I'd imagined that part. Then I didn't. Walter closed his eyes. Ubana, because he knew the song, he knew how exactly the song, a Carter family number that Daniel had learned from Walter's own father before Walter's father died, and that Daniel had sung constantly and quietly and always slightly off-key in the way of people who love music more than they're good at it. He didn't say this to Boone. He couldn't have formed the words. He got me to cover, Boone said, applied pressure to the leg, stayed with me until the medevac came. 6 weeks later, I heard he was gone. A pause, the longest one yet. I didn't handle that well. No, Walter said in a voice that was very nearly nothing. Neither did we. The room was so quiet that the rain against the roof sounded like applause. Luke, who had drifted in from the garage doorway at some point during Boone's account, was leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed and his eyes on the floor. The posture of someone who has heard parts of this story before, but is understanding it differently now in this room with these people, in the way that context changes everything. Travis hadn't moved from the counter. He was looking into his coffee mug with the focused attention of a man who is giving other people their moment and has enough self-awareness to know that's what the situation requires. Evelyn sat down. She sat down beside Walter, not touching him, not yet, but close enough that the warmth of her was present and deliberate, and she looked at Boone Carter with the expression she wore when she had made a decision about someone, and it was the kind of decision you didn't revisit. You've been carrying this alone, she said. It wasn't a question either. I've been carrying it with him, Boone said, and he glanced toward where Luke was standing against the wall, and Luke looked up and their eyes met for a second in the specific wordless way of people who have been through enough together that language has become optional. How, Evelyn said. How did you carry it? Boone was quiet for the moment. I kept moving, he said. For a long time, that was all I could do. You keep moving fast enough, the thing behind you can't quite catch up. He looked at the table. Except it always does. Eventually, it always does. Walter opened his eyes. He was looking at Boone Carter, and he was thinking something that he did not yet have the architecture to say out loud, which was that the man sitting across from him, this leather-jacketed, road-worn, pneumonia-ridden stranger who had appeared at his door in the worst storm of the season, was grief. Not like Walter's grief, but grief the same way a river is a river, whether it's the Mississippi or a creek in a field. The same water, the same direction, the same pull. The garage, Walter said. He said it slowly, like a man feeling his way in the dark. The anonymous donations. He stopped. That was you. Boone didn't answer immediately. He held Walter's gaze for a moment, and then he looked away, the first time he'd looked away since he'd started talking. In a man like Boone Carter, Walter was already learning looking away meant the thing you were looking away from mattered more than most things. How long, Walter said. 8 years, Boone said, quiet. Final. The way you say something you've rehearsed so many times it has worn smooth at the edges. Walter sat back in the chair. 8 years. He tried to reconstruct the last 8 years in his mind, the envelopes that had arrived, the anonymous cashier's checks that had kept the power on, and the bank from calling in the note, and the suppliers from cutting them off. He and Evelyn had assumed it was a charitable organization, some veterans assistance fund, the kind of thing that you didn't look too hard at because you needed it too much to risk asking questions. He had thanked God for it on the nights when he thanked God for anything, and he had kept the garage open, and he had not questioned it. Why, Walter said, and he didn't mean why the money. He meant the whole of it, why the secrecy, why the decade of distance, why tonight, why this, why all of it. Boone looked at him again, and what was in his face now was something Walter hadn't seen there before, which was simply and plainly the face of a man who was tired, not sleepy, tired in the way that has no cure except time, and sometimes not even that. Because I didn't save him, Boone said. He saved me, and there's no way to make that even. There's no way to pay that back. All you can do is... He stopped, started again. All I could do was try to make sure that what he left behind kept standing. Walter Hayes was 72 years old. He had buried his son. He had buried his father and his mother and 2 brothers and 3 friends who had mattered more than he'd ever told them. He had survived a beating that should have killed him, a financial crisis that had nearly finished what the beating started, and 50 years of the specific, relentless kind of quiet grief that never makes the news because it doesn't look like anything from the outside. He was not a man who reached across tables. He reached across the table. He put his hand on Boone Carter's arm, not the grip of a man making a gesture, but the grip of a man holding on. And he didn't say anything because there was nothing adequate to say, and both of them knew it, and that knowing was itself a kind of language. Evelyn beside him pressed her hand over his. Nobody in the room said a word for a long time. And then Travis cleared his throat from the counter, and it wasn't rude. It was just the sound of a large man who has feelings he doesn't know what to do with, and clears his throat as a substitute. Ma'am, he said to Evelyn, I don't suppose there's more of that soup. John and Evelyn laughed, actually laughed sudden and genuine and slightly wet at the edges, and she stood up and went back to the stove, and the sound of the ladle against the pot was the most ordinary and necessary sound in the world. Walter sat back. He kept his hand on Boone's arm for another moment. Then he released it, and he sat straight, and he breathed. Travis, he said. Travis looked over. You said you were a paramedic. Was, Travis said, long time ago. What does he need? What should we be watching for tonight? Travis set down his mug, and his entire demeanor shifted, not dramatically but perceptibly, the way a person shifts when you hand them back something they were good at and had stopped believing they were good at. He stood up from the stool and moved toward the booth, and he was a different man moving than the man who'd been sitting. His breathing is better than it was when we came in, Travis said, checking Boone's pulse with 2 fingers against his wrist with a practiced automatic gesture. The warmth is helping. He needs fluids, he needs to stay still, and he glanced at Boone. He needs to stop talking for a while. I'm right here, Boone said. I know exactly where you are, Travis said. Lie back down. Boone lay back. He didn't argue. Walter filed this away. Luke came away from the wall and sat down at the counter on the stool closest to the door. The stool of a man who was still, even now, keeping one eye on the exits out of a habit he probably didn't even notice in himself anymore. He wrapped both hands around the mug Evelyn set in front of him and stared into it, and then said without looking up, He wasn't going to come here, I want you to know that. He had a plan. He always has a plan, and the plan was to get to Memphis, make some calls, and have someone else deliver what he wanted to deliver. He paused. Then the storm hit, and the road closed, and he started getting worse. A breath. I used to think God didn't plan things. Now I'm not sure. What did he want to deliver? Evelyn said from the stove. Luke looked up at her, then at Walter. There was something in his face that was careful and deliberate, the expression of someone who knows more than they've been authorized to say, and is calibrating exactly where the line is. That's his to tell, Luke said, when he's better. Walter looked at Boone, who was lying back in the booth now, with his eyes closed and the color in his face slightly improved. Still bad, but improved in the way that means the wrong direction has been corrected before it became permanent. All right, Walter said. He stood up, he went to the kitchen, and came back with a dish towel and his reading glasses and the notebook with the numbers in it. Not because he needed to look at the numbers again, he had them memorized, but because his hands needed something to do, and the notebook was habit. He sat at the counter 3 stools down from Luke and opened it. Luke glanced at it, then looked away, then looked back. Is that the garage finances? Luke said. It's nothing, Walter said. It doesn't look like nothing. Walter looked at him over his glasses. It was not an inviting look. Luke raised both hands in a small, peaceful surrender. Sorry, none of my business. No, Walter said. Then after a pause that surprised even himself, the bank wants $42,000 by the end of the month. A man named Vance has been trying to buy this land for 10 years. He thinks he's going to get it. Walter looked at the notebook. He might be right. He didn't know why he'd said that. He hadn't told anyone except Evelyn, and even with Evelyn, he'd only told her half of how bad it was. He had spent 60 years being a man who did not say the thing that made him look like he was losing. Luke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, How much do you need total? Everything. I'm not offering anything, Luke said quickly. I'm just asking. I like to know the whole shape of a problem before I decide I can't solve it. Walter studied him. Where did you learn that? Luke glanced toward the booth where Boone lay resting. He didn't answer. Walter looked at the notebook. 60 maybe, to be safe. Luke nodded. He didn't say anything else. He drank his soup when Evelyn put it in front of him, and he didn't look at the notebook again, but Walter noticed that he'd taken his phone out and set it face down on the counter, and then a few minutes later, picked it up and typed something into it with his thumbs and set it back down. Walter noticed. He said nothing. The storm outside peaked somewhere around 2:30 in the morning, and then began almost imperceptibly to ease. Not to stop, it would not stop until well after sunrise, but to ease in the way of things that have been saying something very loudly and have finally said most of it. The radio was still reporting road closures. The highway patrol barricade was still up. Nobody was going anywhere. Walter stood up and went back to the garage. He wasn't done with the carburetor, and anyway, the work was the only language he had left for what he was feeling, and there was a great deal he was feeling, and no other vocabulary for it. He was in there for nearly 40 minutes before he heard footsteps behind him. He expected Luke. It was Travis. The big man stood in the doorway of the garage the way big men stand in doorways, slightly sideways, conscious of their dimensions, and he looked at what Walter was doing and then at Walter himself. You need a hand, Travis said. I've been doing this for 50 years, Walter said. I know, I can see that. A pause. I was a mechanic before I was a paramedic, before everything else. He said the last 2 words with a specific, careful flatness that meant there was a great deal packed into them, and he wasn't going to unpack it unless asked. Walter looked at him for a moment. Then he moved to the right and made room. And Travis came in without another word and crouched down beside the bike. And for a while, the only sounds were the rain on the metal roof and the specific, intimate language of 2 men working on an engine together, which is one of the few languages that doesn't require anything except the work itself. Prison, Travis said after a while, not explaining it, just naming it, the way you name something to prevent it from having power over the conversation. I figured, Walter said. I was inside for 9 years. Assault, He stopped, adjusted something on the engine. I hurt someone. I'm not going to tell you it wasn't my fault because it was. I'm not going to tell you I'm a different person now because you'd have no reason to believe that. What are you going to tell me? Walter said. Nothing, Travis said. I'm going to help you fix this carburetor, and that's all. He paused. But if you want to know something, Boone showed up at my gate 6 months after I got out. I don't know how he found me. I don't know why he came. He said, Travis exhaled through his nose. A man's worst moment doesn't have to be his last chapter. Just like that. Like it was obvious. He shook his head. I told him to get off my porch. He didn't, Walter said. He did not, Travis confirmed. He sat on the step for 2 hours. Then I came back out and we talked. He handed Walter a wrench without being asked the right one. That was 4 years ago. Walter took the wrench. They worked in silence for a while longer. What was he like? Travis said. Your son. Walter's hand slowed. He thought about saying the thing people say, which is, I'd rather not, or it was a long time ago, the verbal equivalence of the Notebook's close cover. He'd said those things for 50 years. He was very practiced at them. But it was 3 a.m, and there was a stranger crouched beside him who had just handed him the right wrench without being asked, and outside, Boone Carter was lying in a diner booth with 50 years of Walter's son's memory in his chest, like carried cargo. And Walter was very, very tired of the wrong kind of silence. Stubborn, Walter said, like his mother. He turned the wrench. He used to argue with me about every single thing I tried to teach him. Every single thing, and then 2 weeks later, I'd catch him doing it exactly the way I'd shown him, and he'd never admit it. Never once, he stopped. Something crossed his face that was almost a smile, the ghost of one, the outline. He was going to open his own garage, right here next to ours. He had a name picked out and everything. What was the name? Travis said. Walter was quiet for a moment. Daniels, he said, just that. He said, people don't need a fancy name, Dad. They just need to know somebody's there. Travis didn't say anything, but his hands stopped moving on the engine for a moment. And when they started again, they were slightly more careful than before, the way a man's hands become careful when he's working on something he's decided matters. And in the diner, through the connecting door that Walter had left cracked open out of habit and a vigilance he hadn't examined, Boone Carter lay on his back in the vinyl booth and breathed the slow, measured breath of a man who is mending. And on the counter beside him sat a phone that Luke had left there, its screen dark, its last message sent. And outside somewhere, past the storm and the road closures and the barricade, the first faint rumble of something that wasn't thunder moved through the dark. None of them heard it yet, but it was already coming. Walter finished the carburetor just before 4 a.m. He knew because the clock on the garage wall, the one with the cracked face that he'd been meaning to replace for 6 years, showed 3:52 when he tightened the last bolt, and 4:04 when he stood up and pressed both hands into the small of his back and let the ache work itself out the way it always did, slow and grudging and without apology. Travis had left an hour earlier. Not abruptly, he'd set down his tools, wiped his hands on a rag, and said, "Good night," in the direct, uncomplicated way of a man who doesn't perform his exits. And Walter had nodded, and that had been sufficient for both of them. Walter had continued working alone, which was how he preferred it, and had thought about everything and nothing in the specific way that manual work allows, where the hands are busy so the mind can move freely without having to go anywhere in particular. Then he came back into the diner. Boone was awake. Not just awake, sitting up straight-backed with both hands around the coffee mug that Evelyn must have refreshed sometime in the last hour, and his color was markedly better. Not good, but better in a way that had crossed a visible threshold, the way a patient crosses from worrying to watchable. His eyes were clear and fixed on the doorway, and when Walter came through them, Boone tracked him with a steadiness that had been absent earlier. Boy, Evelyn was asleep in the chair behind the register. She'd pulled her cardigan tight around her and tucked her feet up and gone under completely, the deep, sudden sleep of a woman who has been running on pure function for hours and finally had allowed herself to stop. She was snoring very softly. Walter looked at her for a moment with something in his face that had no name but had been there for 51 years. Luke was asleep at the counter, head on his folded arms, one hand still loosely around his phone. The fourth man, whose name Walter had finally learned was Cole, and who had barely said 10 words all night, was sitting in the corner booth with his eyes open, watching the room with the alert, patient stillness of someone trained to watch rooms. He gave Walter a small nod. Walter returned it. Walter poured himself a coffee, came around the counter, pulled out the chair he'd used before, the one that faced the booth without being in it, and he sat down. Boone looked at him. "You fixed the bike," Boone said. "Carburetor was flooded," Walter said. "Would have left you stranded." "Thank you." "Don't," Walter said. "Not unkind, just direct." Boone accepted this. He drank from his mug, set it down. And then he did something that Walter had not expected. which was to reach into the inside pocket of his leather jacket, the jacket that was draped over the back of the booth, and remove an envelope. Old. The kind of old that means handled, carried, folded, and unfolded more times than the paper was ever designed to endure. He set it on the table between them. Walter looked at it, didn't touch it. "What is that?" he said. "A letter," Boone said. "Daniel wrote it, in country. I don't know who it was addressed to, he never told me. He gave it to me the night before the ambush, said..." Boone stopped, steadied himself, said, "Adame, if something happens to me, make sure this gets somewhere it matters." Those were his words. Make sure this gets somewhere it matters. Walter's hand moved toward the envelope and then stopped. "I've been carrying it for 54 years, Boone said quietly. "I've moved it from jacket to jacket. Every jacket I've owned since 1970. First thing I do is put that letter in the inside pocket." He looked at the envelope on the table. "I tried to find your family 3 different times before I actually did. Took me until 2002. "And then you sat in the parking lot," Walter said. "And then I sat in the parking lot," Boone said. "Yeah." Walter picked up the envelope. It was lighter than he expected, which somehow made it heavier. He turned it over. His son's handwriting on the front, and the sight of it did what the sight of Daniel's handwriting always did, which was to bypass every defense Walter had ever constructed and go straight to the place that had never healed and never would. He knew that handwriting. He had a grocery list in that handwriting in the kitchen drawer. He had kept a grocery list for 54 years. He did not open the envelope. Not yet. He set it on his side of the table and pressed 2 fingers lightly on top of it, and he breathed, and he looked at Boone. "There's more," Walter said. It wasn't a question. He could feel it, the specific gravity of a conversation that has more left in it than what's been said. Boone nodded. "The ambush," he said. "I told you the basic shape of it, but I didn't tell you all of it." He paused. "Daniel didn't just drag me to cover. He made a decision that I have spent 50 years thinking about. A decision that..." He stopped again, and this time the stop was longer, the kind that means the next thing is the hardest thing. "There was another man down, between me and the tree line. A man named Eddie Rourke from Beaumont, Texas. Daniel saw him. I saw Daniel see him." Walter's hand on the envelope went very still. "He couldn't get us both," Boone said. "He came to me first because I was closer. He got me to cover, and then he went back for Eddie." A breath. "He got Eddie too. Both of us. He made 2 trips into open ground under fire." He looked at Walter with absolute directness. "Your son pulled 2 men out that afternoon, not 1, 2. Walter closed his eyes. "The official record says 1, Boone said. "I don't know why. Maybe the report got confused. Maybe Eddie didn't say anything. He died 8 months later in a different engagement, so there was nobody to correct it. But I was there. I saw it with my eyes." Surprised on. His voice dropped. "Your son should have been decorated twice over for what he did that afternoon, and nobody knows. Nobody ever knew except me." The room was absolutely quiet. Walter sat with his eyes closed for so long that Boone began to wonder if he'd said something wrong. Then Walter opened them, and what was in them was not grief, or not only grief. There was something else there too, something older and harder and more complicated than grief. "He never told us any of it," Walter said. "In his letters, he never said a word about any of it." "No," Boone said, "he wouldn't have." "How do you know he wouldn't have?" "Because I knew him," Boone said simply. 3 months. That's how long we served together before he died. 3 months, and I knew him well enough to know he was the kind of man who does things and then never mentions them. The kind that would drag 2 men out of a firefight and then write home about the weather. He paused. "Was he..." Walter made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a boy, and occupied the precise territory between the two. "Yeah," he said, "that was him. I thought so." They sat with it. Outside, the rain continued its slow retreat from the violence it had been earlier. The radio murmured low. The clock on the wall clicked toward 4:30, and then Cole said from the corner booth without looking up, "He's not telling you the rest of it." Both men looked at him. Cole was looking at the table in front of him. He had the specific, carefully neutral expression of a man who has decided to say something and is committed to it now. "Cole," Boone said, a warning in it. "He should know," Cole said. He looked up. His eyes went to Walter. "Boone didn't just send money for 8 years. Before that, when he found out the bank was going to call in the original note on this property, 2009, the crash, when everything went bad, Boone put up his own house as collateral to cover the loan extension. He said it flat factual with the same even delivery he might use to report road conditions. He was renting for 4 years after that. Didn't tell anybody why. The silence that followed this was a different kind than the silences before it. Walter turned to look at Boone. Boone was looking at Cornell with the expression of a man who is weighing whether to be angry and has decided it requires more energy than he currently has. He settled for a long exhale through his nose. "That was private," Boone said. "He deserved to know," Cole said. And then he went back to looking at the table, his contribution, complete his position, clearly unmoved. Walter stared at Boone. "Your house," Walter said. "It was just a house," Boone said. "It was your house." "Walter." "No, you put up your house." Walter's voice was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the voice of a man who is processing something so far outside his existing framework that he has to go very quiet to do it. For a man you'd never met. For a family you'd never spoken to. For a piece of property in Mississippi that you sat in the parking lot of and then drove away from. Boone met his gaze and held it and didn't flinch from him. "Your son gave me my life," Boone said. "He didn't ask me first. He didn't know me. He made 2 trips into hell for 2 strangers, and he never wrote home about the weather. So," he shrugged, and the shrug was such an exact replica of the gesture Daniel used to make, that same particular roll of one shoulder that meant the subject was simpler than you were making it, that Walter's breath stopped completely for a full second. "Yeah, I put up a house. It wasn't complicated." Walter stood up. When he walked away from the table, not far to the counter, 4 steps, and he stood there with both hands on the edge of it and his head down. Evelyn stirred in the chair behind the register, but didn't wake. Luke raised his head from his arms. He looked at Walter's back. He looked at Boone. Boone shook his head slightly, the universal signal for "give him a minute," and Luke lowered his head back down. Walter stood at the counter for a long time, and when he turned around, his face had rearranged itself, not back to the closed, guarded configuration it had worn when they'd knocked on the door that was gone, and he couldn't have retrieved it if he'd tried, but rearranged nonetheless, into something that was working very hard and doing a reasonable job. Daniel would have hated this, Walter said. Hated what Boone said. This, being discussed, having people. He made a gesture that was both everything and nothing. He would have walked in here about now and told all of us to stop being ridiculous and go to sleep. Boone smiled. It was the first time Walter had seen him smile, and it transformed his face in a way that was startling, younger suddenly, and unguarded in a way that Walter suspected was rare. "Yeah," Boone said. "That sounds right." "He would have liked you," Walter said. And the smile stayed. "I know," Boone said. "I liked him." Walter came back to the chair. He sat down. He picked up the envelope again, turned it in his hands, and this time he opened it. He read it alone in the sense that Boone looked away and Luke had his head down and Cole was studying the table, and the entire room gave Walter Hayes the privacy of their deliberate inattention. He read it the way you read something you have needed for decades without knowing exactly what you needed, slowly going back over lines, his lips moving slightly on the hard ones. He read it twice. Then he folded it along its original creases, the ones worn almost to transparency, and he put it back in the envelope. He set the envelope on the table. He put his hand flat on top of it and kept it there. "He says he doesn't know if he's coming home," Walter said. He wasn't addressing anyone in particular. He was just saying it because it had been sealed in that envelope for 54 years and it needed air. He says he's made peace with that. He says he stopped. He says, "Don't let it make you smaller." Those are his words. "Don't let it make you smaller. Whatever happens, don't close off." His voice held. Bun had held for another 3 seconds. Then it didn't, and he stopped talking, and nobody in the room said anything, and that was exactly right. Boone reached across the table and put his hand on the envelope beside Walter's hand. Not on top of it, beside it, just present, just there. Walter looked at those 2 hands, his own, and the hand of the man his son had saved on the letter his son had written the night before, the day that saved the man, and he understood something that he had not understood in 54 years of carrying the loss. He understood that Daniel had not simply died in Vietnam. Daniel had been living in ways Walter couldn't see in every life that Boone Carter's survival had touched. In Luke, who was alive because Boone had sat on his porch. In Travis, who was here in this garage instead of somewhere worse because Boone had found him. In the donations that had kept the lights on. In the house Boone had given up without telling anyone. The ripple going outward year after year, invisible and constant. His son had not just saved one man, and the knowledge of it was almost too large to fit inside a human chest. He was still sitting with that when Boone's phone buzzed on the table. Boone picked it up, read the message. Something changed in his face, a tightening of decision being made. "I need to make a call," Boone said. "It's 4 a.m, Walter said. "He'll be awake," Boone said. He was already looking at the screen, already dialing. Walter watched him. "Who?" Boone looked up, and the expression on his face was the first thing since he'd walked through the door that Walter couldn't read, not grief, not guilt, not the complicated piece of a debt being settled. Something else, something that was closer to intention, to purpose. "There are people," Boone said carefully, "who owe Daniel Hayes a debt they've never had the chance to pay because they never knew who to pay it to." He held Walter's gaze. "I've been waiting 12 years to make this call. I'm not waiting anymore." He put the phone to his ear. Walter sat very still. The call connected. Boone said, "It's me. I found Daniel Hayes' family." A pause listening, then Highway 17, Coahoma County. "Yeah." Another pause. "However many can make it." He looked at Walter across the table with those water-pale eyes, and for the first time they held something that was entirely and unmistakably forward-facing. "It's time we repay the debt." He ended the call. He set the phone down. Walter looked at him for a long time. "What did you just do?" Walter said. Boone leaned back in the booth. He looked for the first time since they carried him through the door, like a man who had put something down that he had been carrying for a very long time. His shoulders were lower. His face was looser. He looked like himself, whatever that looked like when the weight was off. "What I should have done 12 years ago," he said. "Boone." Walter's voice was quiet but precise. "What is coming to my property?" Boone closed his eyes. "People who needed saving," he said, "and got it. From men like your son." He opened them again. "And who have been looking for somewhere to put what they owe." Walter stared at him. Then he stood up slowly, the way a man stands when his knees and his mind are both working at half speed, and he walked to the window that looked out over Highway 17, and he stood there in the dark before dawn, with the rain coming down and the road empty in both directions. Luke raised his head from the counter. He looked at Boone, then at Walter's back. "Should we tell him how many?" Luke said. Boone considered this. "No," he said quietly. "Let it be what it's going to be." Walter stood at the window. He did not know what was coming. But somewhere in the dark beyond the storm along the roads that fed into Highway 17, from 3 states and 100 different broken and rebuilt lives engines were waking up. And not one of them was moving slow. "You said part 4, Louis Viet Bong into Liên Kết Liên Mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện phá hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại." Walter stood at that window for a long time, long enough that the rain began to thin. Not stop, but thin in the way that means the worst has passed, and what's left is just the tail end of something that was much bigger than it is now. Long enough that the sky at the far eastern edge began to separate from black into something that wasn't quite dark and wasn't quite light. Yet that in-between hour that doesn't have a good name, but that Walter had always privately thought of as the hour of reckoning, because it was always in that hour, in his experience across 72 years, that the things you'd been avoiding in the dark became unavoidable. And he was thinking about Daniel. Not in the usual way, not the grief thinking that he'd spent 5 decades getting practiced at, the kind that wore a groove in your mind so familiar you could navigate it without looking. He was thinking about Daniel the way Boone had described him. Daniel moving through open ground, Daniel making 2 trips, Daniel singing some half-remembered Carter family song under his breath while he dragged a stranger through enemy fire. Daniel putting a letter in another man's pocket the night before and saying, "Make sure this gets somewhere it matters." Walter had known his son for 23 years. He'd thought he knew him completely. He was standing at the window at 5 in the morning, Understanding that he had known him the way you know a river from the bank, which is to say he had known his shape, his sound, his general direction. But Boone Carter had known him in the current. And the difference between those two kinds of knowing was the distance between the man Walter had grieved and the man Daniel had actually been. The man Daniel had actually been was larger than the loss. That was the thing. That was the unbearable, necessary world-rearranging thing. That Walter was standing at the window holding on to Daniel had been larger than the loss. And Walter had spent 54 years making the loss the whole of him, and it wasn't. It had never been. Walter. Devlin. She was awake, had been for a while probably. She knew his silences the way musicians know rests not as absence but as part of the composition. She had come to stand beside him at the window without him hearing her move, which she had always been able to do, and she put her hand into his without looking at him, without making a production of it, just placed her hand in his, the way you place something in its rightful spot. He gripped it. "Did you read it?" she said. She meant the letter. "Yes." "Is it?" She stopped herself, tried again. "Was it, it's him?" Walter said. "Every word, it's him." She pressed her lips together, nodded once. Outside, the rain was barely a suggestion now. "Boone made a call," Walter said. "I know, I heard." She was quiet for a moment. "What do you think is coming?" "I don't know." "Are you scared?" He thought about it honestly, which was something he'd gotten better at in the last 4 hours than he'd been in the previous decade. "No," he said slowly. "I don't think that's what this is." She looked at him, then turned her head and looked at the side of his face the way she did when she was checking something that couldn't be checked any other way. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her. "All right," she said, and she kept his hand. It was Luke who heard them first. He'd been awake for the last 40 minutes, sitting very still at the counter, with his phone in his hands, watching the screen, the way you watch something you're responsible for and can't control. He'd made and received 4 calls in the last hour, each one brief, each one with the same compressed, efficient energy of someone coordinating logistics. Walter had watched him from the window without comment, had understood instinctively that whatever was happening was already in motion, and questioning it was not going to change its trajectory. Then Luke's head came up. His chin lifted slightly, the instinctive animal gesture of someone whose ears have caught something before the conscious mind has processed it. He turned toward the window. Then he stood up from the stool, slow and deliberate, and he walked to the door. "They're here," he said. Walter heard it then. Not loud, not yet. A low, rhythmic sound from the direction of the highway barricade 8 miles east. The sound of engines. Many engines. The kind of collective sound that has texture to it that you feel in your sternum before you fully register it with your ears. He let go of Evelyn's hand. He went to the door and opened it. The rain had stopped. He hadn't noticed the exact moment it stopped, but it had. The air was wet and cold and smelled of earth and the specific clean that only comes after a storm has finished saying everything it had to say. The parking lot was still sheeted with shallow water that reflected the first gray light of the coming morning. The sound from the east was getting louder. Travis appeared in this garage doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. Cole came out of the shadows by the far wall. Boone, who had no business being on his feet and had evidently made his peace with that fact, was standing in the diner doorway behind Walter, one hand on the frame for balance, his color better than it had been, but still not good enough to fool anybody. "Boone," Travis said, "a warning." "I'm standing in a doorway," Boone said. "I'm not running a marathon." "You need to." Travis, the way Boone said it, closed the subject. The sound was distinct now. Individual. You could separate the engines from each other if you listened to 100 different machines, 100 different voices in the same conversation. Walter stood in his parking lot in the early morning with the wet gravel under his boots and the gray sky overhead, and he listened to that sound grow, and he felt something happening in his chest that he didn't have a precise name for. It was not fear. It was the opposite of what he'd felt standing at the window 12 hours ago, watching headlights pull into his lot and reaching for the shotgun. It was the exact precise opposite of that. The first ones came around the long curve a mile east of the property, just visible, then more visible, then fully present. 1, 5, 10, 20. The number kept compounding and Walter kept counting and stopped counting somewhere around 50 because the count had become irrelevant. They were simply coming. They kept coming. From the east along Highway 17, from the north along County Road 9, from the south along a farm road, Walter had driven 1,000 times and thought of as his own because it only ever led here. They filled the highway. They filled his lot. They kept coming until the lot was full, and they lined the highway shoulder in both directions as far as he could see. Walter Hayes stood very still. He did not speak. He was not capable of speech. The engines cut one by one in a wave, and the silence that replaced them was so complete after the accumulation of sound that it felt like a physical thing, like the air had changed consistency. A man climbed off the nearest bike and walked toward Walter. He was Walter's age, mid-70s, gray-haired, with a veteran's pin on his jacket lapel, and the walk of a man who had once carried weight for a living and still moved like he expected to have to again. He stopped 3 feet from Walter, and he looked at him with the kind of directness that belongs to men who have run out of time for anything that isn't direct. "Are you Walter Hayes?" he said. "Yes," Walter said. "My name is Earl Maddox. I served with the American Division 1969 to 1971. He paused. "I never met your son personally, but the man who saved my life in 71 was saved by your son a year before that." He extended his hand. "It travels," he said. "Whatever Daniel did, it traveled." Walter shook his hand. That was when the second man came forward. Then a third. Then Walter stopped being able to track the individual moments because they were coming too fast and from too many directions, and each one carried a variation of the same essential sentence, which was your son in a chain of events, and I am standing here because of it. A man named Gary, who had been in addiction recovery for 11 years because Boone Carter had been in addiction recovery, which he'd gotten into because a man named Luke had stayed clean, which Luke had done because Boone had found him in a parking lot, which Boone had been able to do because he was alive. A woman, one of only 3 or 4 women in the convoy, a firefighter from Memphis with a gray braid down her back, who said her father had been the second man Daniel dragged out of that firefight, Eddie Rourke's unit mate, and she had grown up hearing Daniel Hayes' name at the dinner table like a prayer. Walter stopped, being able to respond individually. He stood and received it, and Evelyn appeared beside him at some point and took his arm, and together they stood in front of Hayes Auto and Diner while the morning came up over Highway 17 and the people kept coming forward. He heard Boone's voice behind him. "This is what I couldn't tell you," Boone said. He'd made it as far as the doorway threshold, leaning against the frame. "I couldn't tell you in words. You have to see it." Walter turned to look at him. "One life," Boone said. "That's all he saved. Mine. One 22-year-old private from Coahoma County, Mississippi, who shouldn't have come back into that field." His voice was steady, but the effort of it was visible. But that one life, Walter, that one life kept going. It kept saving people. For 54 years, it kept going. He gestured toward the parking lot. "These are the ones who could come on this much notice, in one night." Walter turned back to the lot. He looked at the faces. He looked at the bikes and the cars that had started arriving behind them, trucks, some of them loaded with lumber and tools and equipment, men in construction gear, men in firefighter jackets, men who had at some point in their lives been part of the ripple. And then he saw something that made his chest lock up completely. At the back of the lot, a man was unloading a sign from the bed of a pickup truck, a hand-painted sign, not cheap, not rushed, done with care, that said in large letters, "Daniel Hayes, Coahoma County, Mississippi." He came back. Below it in smaller letters, "So did we." Walter's jaw worked. Nothing came out. Evelyn made a sound beside him, small, involuntary, the kind of sound that comes out when feelings exceed the body's containment capacity. She pressed her face into his shoulder for one moment, and he put his arm around her and held her there. And they stood like that together, watching the people in their parking lot while the sun came the rest of the way up over the flat Mississippi horizon. He did not know how long he stood there, long enough that he became aware of activity, organized, purposeful activity spreading through the crowd around him. Men pulling tools from saddlebags, women organizing what appeared to be a donation collection, the lumber coming off the trucks. And Travis was in the middle of a gaze. Walter could see him moving through the crowd with the easy authority of a man who knows how to organize physical work, directing, distributing, making decisions with the quick efficiency of someone who had done it before and found it in himself again right now. He caught Walter's eye once across the lot, and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe. The specific understanding of two men who have worked side by side on an engine at 3 in the morning. Luke was on his phone. He'd been on his phone continuously. Walter realized since the convoy started arriving, fielding calls, making calls, managing something with the focused, unhurried competence of a man who had apparently been planning this for longer than one night. He met Walter's gaze and held it for a moment and gave him the smallest possible nod, the kind that says, "I told you I like to know the full shape of a problem." Walter looked at the garage sign, the old one, the one the storm had damaged at the top, the one that said Hayes Auto and Diner, in letters that had been repainted twice in 40 years and were due for a third. Two men were already up on ladders looking at it, assessing. He went to them. "What are you doing?" he said. As the closer man, young 20s with a painter's build and the particular squinting focus of someone who sees surfaces professionally, looked down. "Fixing your sign, sir," he said. "If that's all right. Who sent you?" The young man pointed toward the lot, which was not a helpful answer because there were 200 people in the lot. "It's all right," said a voice behind him. Walter turned. Earl Maddox was there, the gray-haired veteran who'd been the first to come forward. "We put it together over the last few hours," Earl said. "When Boone's call went out last night, it went wide. People started organizing." He looked at the garage, at the lot, at the organized activity spreading through both. "This isn't the first time we've done something like this. Just the first time we have done it here." He paused. "Is it all right? We should have asked before we—" "Earl," Walter said. "Yes, sir. My son Daniel was a man who did things first and explained them later." Walter looked at the ladders against the sign, at the trucks with lumber, at the 200 people in his lot at 6 in the morning on a weekday. "I think he'd say it was all right." Earl smiled. It was a veteran's smile, the kind that holds more history than it shows. "Yes, sir," he said. "I think he would." The county sheriff arrived at 6:47. Walter knew because he was watching the road and he saw the cruiser and he recognized the vehicle before he saw the markings because he'd known Dale Briggs since Dale was a patrolman who used to stop at the diner for pie every Tuesday and complain about his back. Dale was 58 now and a county sheriff and still complained about his back whenever he came in, which was less often than it used to be. Dale pulled into what remained of the lot entrance, which was narrow because of the bikes lined up on either side, and he got out of the cruiser and stood next to it and took off his hat and looked at what was in front of him for a long moment. Walter went to him. "Morning, Dale." Dale kept looking at the lot. "Walter," he said without shifting his gaze, "I've been getting calls since 5:30 this morning. Got a complaint from Richard Vance at 542 specifically." "I imagine you did. He says you've got an illegal gathering on your property." Dale put his hat back on. "He also says—" He stopped, turned to look at Walter with the expression of a man who has heard an extraordinary amount of information in a short period of time and is trying to arrange it into something coherent. "He says there's a news crew on the way." "I didn't call any news crew," Walter said. "I know you didn't. Vance did. He thinks this is going to make you look bad." Dale looked back at the lot, at the organized work, at the people moving with purpose, at the sign painters and the lumber crew and the collection tables and the 200 people who had driven through the night to be in a mechanic's parking lot in Coahoma County, Mississippi at sunrise. Dale was quiet for a long time. "What is this, Walter?" he said, not suspicious, just genuinely asking. Walter thought about how to answer that. He thought about all the ways to answer it, about Vietnam, and a 22-year-old private and a man with pneumonia in a diner booth, and a letter carried for 54 years, and a house given up without telling anyone, and 8 years of anonymous donations, and a call made at 4 in the morning. "My son saved a man's life in 1970, Walter said. "These are the people that man's life saved after that." Dale looked at him. Walter looked back. "All right," Dale said. He settled his hat more firmly on his head. "I don't see any ordinance violation here. Private property, organized gathering, no indication of anything criminal." He paused. "I'm going to get a cup of coffee if Evelyn's still making it." "She started a fresh pot 20 minutes ago," Walter said. "Good," Dale said, and he walked toward the diner. The news crew arrived at 7:15. Two of them, a reporter and a camera operator from a Memphis station, visibly not expecting what they found. Walter could see the reporter recalibrating in real time as she walked through the lot, her prepared narrative shifting under the weight of the actual event. She found Walter near the garage door. "Mr. Hayes," she said with the practiced composure of a professional, surprised by something more than she expected. "Can you tell me what's happening here today?" Walter looked at the lot, at the work, at the people, at Boone Carter, who had finally been persuaded to sit down on a folding chair that Luke had placed outside the diner door like a throne for a reluctant king, and who was watching all of it with the expression of a man seeing something he has been hoping for so long that the actual arrival of it is almost incomprehensible. One at Evelyn moving through the crowd with the coffee pot like she had been expecting all of them and had simply been keeping it warm. At the sign, half repainted, Daniel's name already written into the new lettering plan that the young painter was sketching on a piece of cardboard. "My son was a soldier," Walter said. "He saved a man's life in Vietnam in 1970. He didn't make it home. But the man he saved," Walter stopped, cleared his throat, continued. "The man he saved spent the next 50 years saving other people. And some of those people saved other people. And last night, the first man showed up at my door in a storm. He looked at the reporter with 72 years of a hard life in his eyes and something new there too. Something that had arrived sometime in the last few hours and was still finding its place. Today, the rest of them came." The reporter looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then she said quietly off the record, "And just as a person, how are you doing?" Walter considered this. "Better than I was yesterday," he said. "By a distance." The twist came from Vance's direction, as it turned out. Richard Vance arrived at 8 o'clock in a car that was too clean for the lot's current condition, and he got out in his press jacket, in his deliberate posture, and he looked at the crowd and looked at the news camera, and Walter could see him, even from 40 feet away, calculating. Vance was always calculating. It was the most consistent thing about him. He walked toward Walter with his hand already extended, the smile of a man who is reversing course and wants the reversal to look like it was the plan all along. "Walter," he said, "this is extraordinary. Truly extraordinary. I had no idea." "Richard," Walter said. He did not take the extended hand. Vance kept the hand out for one beat too long, then retracted it smoothly. "I want you to know," he said, lowering his voice, "that my interest in this property was always—" "Richard." Walter's voice was quiet, exact. The voice of a man who has spent a long night becoming very clear about what all he does and doesn't have patience for. "The camera is right there. Whatever you're about to say to me, you can say it to everyone." Vance's jaw tightened. The calculation behind his eyes ran very fast. "Why?" Luke appeared as if from nowhere, standing slightly to Walter's left. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He was simply present in the way of someone who has learned from Boone Carter that sometimes presence is the entire statement. Behind Vance, a woman was talking to the reporter. She had a file folder in her hand. Physical documents, the kind that journalists pay attention to, and she was speaking with the precise, measured delivery of someone who has been waiting for the right moment to say what she's saying. Walter looked at her. He didn't know her. He looked at Luke. "Investigative journalist," Luke said quietly without looking at him. "She's been looking into Vance's highway expansion scheme for 2 years. She heard about what was happening here." A pause. "She drove through the night." Walter looked back at Vance. Vance was looking at the journalist, and the documents, and the camera, and the calculation in his eyes had reached its conclusion, and the conclusion was not favorable, and he knew it. "I'm going to go," Vance said. To Walter, just to Walter, dropping the performance entirely. "That's probably best," Walter said. Vance went. Walter watched him leave and felt nothing in particular about his departure, not triumph, not satisfaction, not even the relief he'd expected. Because Vance had never been the real thing. Vance had been the symptom. The disease was fear, and the fear was already gone, and without the fear, Vance was just a man in a clean car driving away from a parking lot full of people who were busy doing something that mattered. Earl Maddox appeared at his elbow. "We've got enough in the collection to cover the banknote," he said. "We're still counting, but it's there. It's definitely there." Walter nodded. "There's more," Earl said. "So—" He hesitated, then continued. "Some of the men here, the construction workers, the contractors, they want to talk to you about the garage, about improvements, structural stuff the storm did damage to. They're saying they can have it right within a week. He paused. No charge. Earl, sir, with respect. Earl said this is not about charity. Not one person in this lot is here out of pity. He said the word the way you say something that doesn't apply. They're here because they owe a debt they've been carrying, and this is the closest they're ever going to get to paying it. Don't take that from them. Walter looked at him. He thought about Boone saying, I didn't save him. He saved me, and there's no way to make that even. Osei, he thought about the garage note paid and the house given up, and 8 years of anonymous checks and a letter in an inside pocket through 40 different winters. He thought about what it meant to carry something and desperately need somewhere to put it down. All right, Walter said. Earl nodded. He went back into the lot. Walter stood alone for a moment, genuinely alone in a crowd of 200 people, in the specific solitude that sometimes finds you in the middle of everything rather than the middle of nothing. He looked at the people working on his property. He looked at the sign. He looked at Boone in the chair by the door, who was talking to Cole, and looked for the first time since Walter had seen him like a man who might actually rest. He looked at the photograph in his mind's eye because he didn't need the wall to see it, had never needed the wall to see it, of a young man in a military uniform with a crooked smile. All right, son, Walter said, very quiet, just for himself and maybe for Daniel, wherever Daniel was when the people whose lives he'd changed came together in his father's parking lot at sunrise. I see it. He went inside. He sat down at the counter. Evelyn put a coffee in front of him and sat beside him, and they looked through the window at the lot together, and neither of them said anything for a long time, and it was the best kind of silence, the kind that has been filled from the outside so completely that it doesn't need anything added to it. Then Evelyn said, we should make more food. Walter looked at her. There are 200 people out there, she said with the matter-of-fact practicality of a woman who has been feeding people for 60 years and sees no reason to stop now. And it's breakfast time. Walter laughed. It came out sudden and full and real, the laugh of a man who has not laughed that way in longer than he can accurately remember, and who has just discovered that the capacity for it never left. It was just waiting for the right morning. He stood up. He went to the kitchen. He got to work. The breakfast rush. If 200 bikers, veterans, construction workers, and firefighters descending on a single diner counter could be called a rush, lasted 3 hours and consumed every egg. Walter had both industrial containers of coffee, 4 loaves of bread, and a quantity of bacon that he would later describe to Dale Briggs as a situation. He didn't mind a single second of it. He moved through the kitchen with the automatic muscle memory efficiency of a man who had been cooking in that space for 40 years, and Evelyn worked beside him. And they didn't talk much because they didn't need to. They had the kitchen language of long marriage, the wordless coordination of 2 people who know each other's rhythms so well that the work becomes a kind of conversation all its own. She knew when to hand him the spatula before he reached for it. He knew when to step left so she could get to the refrigerator. It was ordinary and it was extraordinary at the same time, which is the definition of most things that matter. Luke came around the counter at some point and started washing dishes without asking. Walter noticed and said nothing, and Luke kept washing, and that was that. Travis took over the grill for 40 minutes when Walter's hands started aching, just stepped in, rolled up his sleeves, and ran the eggs with the focused competence of a man rediscovering something he'd lost the address to. Walter sat on the stool behind the counter and drank coffee and watched him and thought about what Travis had said in the garage at 3 a.m. A man's worst moment doesn't have to be his last chapter. Boone's words delivered to a stranger on a porch. Now here was the stranger running the grill in Walter's kitchen like he'd been hired for the shift. Well, some things don't have a better word than grace. By 10 a.m, the food was gone and the crowd had thinned, but not emptied. Maybe 60, 70 people still in the lot. The ones who were working on the garage structure and the sign and the storm damage to the fence along the east side of the property. The news crew had been there for 2 hours. The Memphis reporter had done 3 separate pieces to camera and was now sitting at the counter talking to Earl Maddox about veteran support networks with the focused attention of a journalist who has walked into something larger than the assignment and knows it. And monsieur, the footage was already online. Walter didn't have a smartphone, had resisted them with the same principled stubbornness he applied to most technology introduced after 1987. But Luke showed him on his phone and Walter sat on the stool and watched 12 seconds of video that had already been watched 400,000 times. And in those 12 seconds, he saw himself from the outside for the first time, a 72-year-old man standing in a parking lot at sunrise, surrounded by 200 people with his wife's hand in his and the morning light on his face. He didn't recognize the expression he was wearing. "What is that?" he said to Luke, pointing at his own face on the screen. Luke looked. "That's peace," Luke said simply and went back to his coffee. Walter looked at the screen for another moment. Then he handed the phone back. He thought about the last time he had felt it, actually felt it, not performed it, not approximated it with the practiced okayness of a man who has learned to function inside grief. He couldn't locate the memory, which told him it had been long enough that the before and the after had lost their clear border, and what he was feeling now was something he would have to learn from the beginning, like a language he'd never spoken. He was willing. Boone found him at 11. Walter was in the garage. He was always in the garage when he needed to think, had been for 50 years, which Evelyn called his relocating, with a tone that contained equal parts affection and exasperation. He was doing inventory mostly, not because it needed doing urgently, but because the garage was where he understood things, and he was working on understanding several things simultaneously. Or Boone came in and stood in the middle of the floor and looked around. He was moving better, not well, not yet, but the labored quality was gone from his breathing, and his color had crossed into the range that Travis had classified that morning as acceptable, if annoying. "How are you feeling?" Walter said. "Like I drove 300 miles in a storm and then got a 50-year secret off my chest," Boone said. "So better than expected." Walter set down the inventory clipboard. For a moment, they just stood there, two men in a garage, which is one of the natural habitats of important conversations. Because garages, unlike living rooms, don't ask anything of you. You can say the hard things in a garage without it feeling like a performance. "I need to ask you something," Walter said. "All right." The ripple, the people outside, Eddie Rourke's daughter, Gary, the man in recovery. All of them. Walter looked at his hands. "You've been doing that for 50 years. Finding people, staying in their lives." "Trying to," Boone said. "Not always getting it right." "What made you start?" Boone was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was slowly the way you speak when you're pulling the words from somewhere they've been stored rather than somewhere they're readily available. "The year after I got back from Vietnam, I was not..." He stopped. "I was not doing well. I'm going to leave it at that. I was not doing well, and I was doing it in ways that were going to have a permanent outcome if something didn't change." Walter didn't fill the silence. "And one morning, I don't even know why, I just sat down and I thought about Daniel. I thought about him coming back into that field. And I thought that man spent something on me. He spent something real on me. And if I throw what he spent on me away, then..." He paused. "Then that's the second time he gets killed. You understand, I couldn't do that. I could not be the man who killed Daniel Hayes twice." His voice was even. He'd said this to himself so many times it had found its cadence. "So I got up, and I stayed up, and I started paying attention to the people around me who needed somebody to come back into the field for them." Walter was looking at him. "You built a whole life out of that," Walter said. "Daniel built it," Boone said. "I just lived inside it." It was the most important sentence Walter Hayes had heard in 54 years. He recognized it immediately, the way you recognize the solution to a problem you've been working on so long, you'd forgotten you were working on it. He felt something in his chest rearrange itself. Not dramatically, quietly, the way a house settles. "He would have argued with you about that," Walter said. "I know it," Boone said. "We can argue about it next time." Walter looked at him. "You planning on coming back?" "If you'll have me," Boone said. Straight, direct, the way he said everything. Walter picked up the inventory clipboard and then set it down again. "I got a booth," he said, "back corner. Evelyn keeps it clear on Tuesday evenings. It doesn't have a sign on it or anything, just nobody sits in it on Tuesdays." He looked at the wall. That was Daniel's night, when he was home. He'd come in and sit in that booth and drink 2 cups of coffee and talk to me through the window between the kitchen and the diner while I cleaned up. He was quiet for a moment. Nobody's sat in it in 54 years. The garage was very still. "I'm not saying you're Daniel," Walter said. "I know exactly who you are, And I know exactly who he was, and they're not the same. I'm just saying, he stopped. Tried again. I'm saying Tuesday evenings are available. If you ever find yourself on Highway 17. Boone Carter looked at the old mechanic for a long time. I'll be here next Tuesday, he said, and the Tuesday after that. Walter nodded once, picked up the clipboard. Good, he said, and went back to the inventory with the specific, focused attention of a man who has said the thing he meant to say and doesn't need to add anything to it. The sign went up at 1 in the afternoon. As the young painter, his name was Marcus Walter, had learned 26 years old, an apprentice out of Memphis who had come because his grandfather had served in New Earl Maddox and had gotten a call at 5 in the morning and said yes, without asking a single question, had been working on it since 8. He'd repainted the main lettering, first the Hayes Auto and Diner, in the clean, bold strokes that Walter had always used and Marcus had matched precisely. Below it, where the storm had cracked the old wood panel, Marcus had fitted a new piece, and on it, in letters that were smaller but no less certain, no one left out in the storm. There was a specific moment, and Walter would remember it for the rest of his life, with the exact frame-perfect clarity that certain moments have, as if life knows they matter and photographs them for you when the sign went up. When the ropes holding it to the post went taut, and Marcus stepped back, and the sign was just there, complete reading what it was going to read for however many years it stood. The people in the lot got quiet. Not all at once in the gradual, organic way that quiet moves through a crowd when something lands. One person, then the people near them, then the people near those people, until the whole lot was still, and everyone was looking at the same thing. Walter stood under the sign. He hadn't planned to. He'd been standing nearby watching the work, and when Marcus stepped back, he'd simply been in the right place at the right moment, the way things sometimes arrange themselves without your participation. Evelyn came and stood beside him. She looked up at the sign. She read it. Her mouth moved very slightly with the words the way it did when she was committing something to memory. He'd hate this, she said. All this fuss. Yeah, Walter said. He'd have gone back inside 15 minutes ago and pretended he didn't see any of it. Yeah, Walter said again. She looked up at the sign for another moment, but he would have loved knowing it happened. She looked at Walter. He always wanted to know that the things he did landed somewhere, even when he pretended he didn't care. Walter looked at her, the woman who had held his hand at the window before dawn, who had opened a pot of soup at midnight for strangers, who had said either we open this door or we live with what happens if we don't, with the simple, immovable certainty of someone who has always known which side of that sentence she lives on. Thank you, he said. She raised her eyebrows. For what? For last night, for opening the door. He paused. For 51 years of opening the door. Evelyn Hayes looked at her husband. There was a long history in her eyes, the whole of a life lived alongside another life, the accumulated weight of all the mornings and all the nights, and all the things said and unsaid between two people who chose each other and kept choosing each other across every version of themselves. That wasn't hard, she said. That was never hard. He put his arm around her. The crowd slowly, gently began to applaud. Not orchestrated, not led by anyone. It simply started somewhere near the back. Someone's hands coming together and then the person next to them and moving forward until it reached the people standing closest to Walter and Evelyn and enclosed them in the sound of it. It wasn't triumphant applause. It was quieter than that, more like recognition, like 200 people confirming something they had all agreed upon without discussing it. Walter stood under the new sign with his wife, and he looked at the faces of the people in his lot, and he did not look away. Then the twist came, and it was the one no one had seen coming. The Memphis reporter was wrapping her final segment when her phone rang. She looked at the screen, frowned slightly, took the call, and her expression shifted in the way of a journalist receiving information that changes the shape of the story. She stepped away from the camera operator. She talked for 3 minutes. When she came back, she had the file folder from the investigative journalist who had driven through the night, and she had something new in her posture, the particular set of a reporter who has just confirmed what she suspected and is now deciding how to handle it responsibly. She found Walter. Mr. Hayes, she said, I need to tell you something, and I want to ask your permission before we report it publicly. Walter looked at her. All right. Richard Vance's highway expansion project, she said. The one he's been using to pressure property owners along this stretch of 17 for the last 6 years. She paused. It doesn't exist. Walter went very still. The State Highway Authority has no record of any approved expansion on this corridor. There's no funding allocated. There's no environmental study. There's no project. She looked at him steadily. Vance has been fabricating the threat of eminent domain to drive property values down so he could buy land cheap. Several properties have already sold to him at a fraction of their value because the owners believed they were going to lose them anyway. A breath. He's been doing this for 8 years. Walter stood completely still. 8 years. The same 8 years Boone had been sending money. The same 8 years Walter had been holding on by his fingernails, convinced that even if he kept the garage, Vance would eventually win by other means. 8 years of a threat that had never been real. 8 years of fear that had been manufactured by a man in a clean car who had looked at this property and seen nothing but money. "Are you going to report it?" Walter said. "With your permission," she said, "and with the documentation my colleague has, which is substantial." Walter looked across the lot at the spot where Vance's car had pulled out that morning, at the absence of him. "Report it," Walter said. She nodded. She went back to her camera operator. And it aired on the 6 o'clock news in Memphis. By 10 that evening, it had been picked up by 2 national outlets. By the following morning, Richard Vance's attorney had issued a statement that confirmed approximately nothing and denied approximately everything, which is what attorneys' statements do when the documentation is substantial. 3 other property owners along Highway 17 had already called the county attorney's office. Walter watched none of this in real time. He found out in pieces over the following days, the way you find out about things you've been freed from gradually with a growing sense of lightness that you keep expecting to reverse, and that doesn't. The last thing that happened on that first day was quiet. By 4 in the afternoon, most people had gone. The work was done, the structural repairs, the sign, the fence, the collection fully counted and sitting in an envelope that Earl had handed Walter with the same straightforward dignity he applied to everything else. The number inside was $63,000 and some change, and Walter had looked at it and then looked at Earl, and Earl had said, "Debt paid," with the absolute finality of a man closing a chapter. Boone was inside. Travis and Cole were loading the last of the equipment back into the truck. Luke was talking to Marcus near the bikes. Dale Briggs had come back after his shift ended in his own clothes and was sitting at the counter drinking coffee and not making any official remarks about anything. Walter went to the garage. He stood in the middle of the floor, just stood there with the familiar smell of oil and metal and 50 years of work around him. He looked at the walls, the tools hanging in their places, the parts organized the way he'd always organized them, the cracked face clock that said 412. He looked at the space where Daniel's garage had been going to be, right next door, the empty lot that Walter had owned for 40 years and never built on because he couldn't. He thought about what Boone had said. Your son saved one man in Vietnam, but that one life kept saving others for 50 years. He thought about Daniel's words from the letter. Don't let it make you smaller. Whatever happens, don't close off. He had been smaller. He had been closed off. He had been closed off for so long that he'd stopped recognizing it as a choice and started experiencing it as weather, just the way things were, the climate of being Walter Hayes, non-negotiable and permanent. But it wasn't permanent. He knew that now in the way you know things that happen in the body rather than the mind, the specific cellular knowledge of a man who has been cold for a very long time and has just come inside. And he heard Evelyn in the doorway. Boone's asking if you want company for a while, she said, or if you'd rather be alone. Walter looked at the empty lot next door through the garage window. Tell him to come out, Walter said. She went. He heard her footsteps and then different footsteps. And then Boone was in the doorway, still moving carefully, still not all the way back, but present in the full sense of the word. He came and stood beside Walter without asking what they were looking at. They were quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about that empty lot, Walter said. The one next door, Boone said. Daniel wanted to build there, his own garage. Walter looked at it. I've owned it for 40 years, never done anything with it. Boone looked at the lot. What are you thinking? I don't know yet, Walter said. Something. He paused. Maybe something for people who need a place to get themselves straight. Veterans. People like Luke was. People who need, he stopped. People who need what you needed somebody to come back into the field and do for them. Boone was very quiet. You'd need help with something like that, he said carefully. I know it, Walter said. Another pause. Tuesday evenings, Boone said. We could talk about it. We could, Walter said. They stood in the garage doorway together and looked at the empty lot, and the late afternoon light came in over the flat Mississippi land, the way it does in October, low and golden and unhurried, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look like they were always supposed to be exactly where they are. 4 months later, Walter repainted the garage sign for the last time. Not because it needed it, Marcus had done it well enough to last another decade, but because Walter needed to be the one to do it. Needed to be the one with his hands on it, with the brush in his bad arthritis-swollen hands, doing the work himself the way he'd always done everything that mattered. Mighty Boone was there. Luke was there. Travis had driven up from Jackson. Marcus had come back because he'd heard and said he wanted to see it. Dale Briggs was there in his own clothes again, coffee in hand, leaning against the cruiser with the easy posture of a man who has stopped expecting to be needed and is just there as a person. Evelyn stood beside Walter and watched him work. The main lettering went first. Hayes Auto and Diner. Steady, certain. The name of a place that was still standing. Then the line beneath. Walter painted each letter carefully. His hands hurt. He painted anyway. He had been painting anyway for 72 years, and he did not intend to stop. When he was done, he stepped back. He looked at what he'd made. No one left out in the storm. Behind him from inside the diner, he could hear voices. The Tuesday evening regulars who had started showing up 6 weeks ago, drawn first by the story, and then by the food, and then by the specific unnameable quality of a place that has decided what it is and means it. Veterans, recovering addicts, ex-convicts trying, young people who needed somewhere to land, old people who needed somewhere to be. The booth in the back corner had Boone in it. Damon had Boone in it every Tuesday now, and sometimes other days too. And the coffee was always hot, and the conversation was always honest, and Walter cooked, and Evelyn served, and the garage lights stayed on. Walter looked at the sign one more time, and he thought about a 23-year-old soldier who had made 2 trips into open ground and never written home about it, who had put a letter in another man's pocket and said, "Make sure this gets somewhere it matters," who had sung a Carter family song under his breath in the worst moment of another man's life. His son had known something that Walter had spent 54 years learning, that the door's the whole thing, that the moment you open it to the stranger, to the fear, to the person who looks nothing like what you expected, help to look like that moment is the whole story. Everything else is just what happens after you're brave enough to stop being small. Walter set down the brush. He put his hand flat against the sign, against the wood, against the letters, against the name of the place his son had loved and the words his son had lived by before Walter had found the words to say them. He kept his hand there for a long moment, then he went inside. The lights were on, the coffee was hot, the booth in the back corner was full, and Hayes Auto and Diner on Highway 17 in Coahoma County, Mississippi was open the way it had always been, and open now in the way it had taken a storm and a dying man and a 54-year-old letter to become open, the way a place is open when it has decided without reservation and without exception that no one gets left out in the storm. Not on their watch. Not ever again.